Regional forms were introduced in Pokemon Generation 7 with Alola, and since then it's been included in every generation, breathing new life into old Pokemon, sparking ideas within the community, and is overall Pokemon's greatest idea ever. Today I will be explaining every single regional form, how it makes sense or relates to real life, and overall why I think it's truly perfect. So I'll be going through all of the regional Pokemon in National Dex order for the most part. There are a few exceptions really here and there when we get to Slowpoke, but not really anything else. So if you want to follow along, you can. If you don't know what a regional form is, it's literally a Pokemon that exists in one region, but it also exists in another. It's a closely related species. Think of it like how it is in real life. You have animals that are related to each other on other continents, and so they have developed different attributes that allow them to survive in that environment. Starting with Rattata, it's a non-native invasive species to Alola. It arrived on a cargo ship. It adapted to nighttime. Its fur color changed to blend in with the night, and it particularly does not like to eat spoiled food. The regular Rattata is native to a lot of other areas, whereas this Rattata that got brought in was actually kind of pushed and shunted away. I don't want to say hunted, but it might as well have been hunted, and so it got used to hiding away in the forest and the shrubbery, anything it can, and only coming out at night. So it had to be it had to stalk its way around, try to get food in a very underhanded way, and actually try to pile it up so that way it had a food source. It ended up becoming a normal dark type, again, because of the underhanded nature, not because it moved to nighttime. It's a thief. That's the whole point of it. So with the piles of food and how much it actually ended up eating, instead of it turning into a normal Raticate, it is its own variant of Raticate, still a Alolan Raticate. It's heavier and has the darker coloring due to the environment. Again, very nighttime predator. You want to blend into your environment so that other predators do not see you, i.e. humans to some degree. The eyes are actually still red. If you look at regular Rattata to regular Raticate, you will notice that the red eyes actually go away. Meanwhile, in the Alolan version, the red eyes stick around. Red eyes are usually indicative of predators that work in the night. It's how, if you look at a certain other, number of other creatures that stalk in the night, you will see that their eyes are a different reflection as they reflect different colors because it allows them to see in the night based on what is going into their cones and what is coming back out. They also, oddly enough, have webbed feet for strong swimming. I wasn't expecting that one when I found that out, but it makes sense when you think about the fact that Alola is a number of islands. Again, Alola is based off of Hawaii. So these Rattata and Raticate were likely doing a lot of movements from island to island in order to get away and survive. It's also more aggressive, and it actually serves as a boss to other Alolan Rattata, instead of it being like other Raticate where they're a little bit more, not want to say reclusive, but a little bit more single or by themselves. The Raticate here and the Rattata rely on each other. So that's your Alolan Rattata. Raichu is an interesting one. It's basically, it changed because of its environment and diet specific to Alola. It is suspected that because of the environment, and specifically whatever is happening with Alolan pancakes, the recipe for them, is what caused this change to happen. Now it has psychic energy, which it uses to float on its tail, and it has a light aroma that you can smell from its cheeks. Alolan Raichu you can kind of push to the idea of nature and nurture. Basically, if you try to treat a creature a certain way, you can domesticate it. If it wants to be domesticated, which you see with a lot of Pokemon in general, but by treating it a certain way, it'll adapt to that if it really loves it. Dogs, they were wolves at one point. Chihuahuas didn't exist, but so didn't a number of other creatures at all. All the dogs came from what, like 10 species of dog that we can track down from. We don't know the original ancestor of all dogs. We just know that it parses from 10. And pulling that into this Raichu idea, we come into, okay, each of these dogs had different diets, they had different environments because of where we put them, and they adapted to those environments, to those diets. They got larger canines, smaller canines. They got better at hunting large prey, small prey, so on and so forth. Again, going back to the Chihuahua idea, rat terriers, to some degree, they are very good at hunting down rats. Sandshrew is one where you have a ground type Pokemon that is very good at rolling itself up, digging, and existing as it does in deserts or drier areas. And now they are in Alola, where they started off as their ground type, but over time they migrated to snowy mountains due to the volcanic activity near the desert area. So they got pushed out. They could no longer stay safe there. Because of this, their body color and composition changed to blend in with the environment. Think of it, they went from a yellowish brown to a whitish blue as they became ice steel types in order to blend in with their snowy environments. Again, we've talked about this, where they are adapting so that way they can hide from predators better. Their bodies became larger and heavier. Their body defends it from Sneasel, which is a natural predator, but now it can't curl itself into a ball. Reason being is its body is more of an armored shell, which it kind of needed to insulate itself to some capacity from the harsh weather. But what it can do is it still burrows into the ground, and now it slips less on ice because of its claws and because of its make. You can also attribute that to weight a little bit as well. But if it wants to go faster, it can slide on its stomach, because if you look at its design, it has that harder exterior, but still has the same Sandshrew underbelly, similar to like how a penguin functions. Now, when it evolves into Sandslash, its quills are now covered in ice. They are taller and resemble icicles. It can still curl into a ball, but rarely due to its thicker hide, so it won't do it very often because it is hard to curl into one. Instead, it actually camouflages itself, looking at the coloration. It emits cold air, which then allows it to sharpen its quills, which is a defense mechanism for it, because it can no longer hide as well, because it can't move as well. Its claws are longer, thinner, and hooked at its tips for scaling icebergs, whereas you'd have your Sandslash, which was good at scaling trees. You need stronger claws to dig into the rock, or, more importantly, dig into the ice, which can be denser than rock in some capacity, depending on where you are. Now it lives in deeper parts of snowy mountains, where the climbing for humans or the people of Alola is forbidden. The stabs from its icicles cause deep wounds and a severe frostbite. So it's gone from something that can roll and move away and relatively defend itself, digging and so on and so forth, to this walking tank that is more likely to get into a fight rather than run away. Vulpix is similar to Sandshrew in a number of different ways. One of the biggest ones is that it also moved to the mountains and then changed. The main reason Vulpix actually moved away was because it just didn't want to be around other Pokemon and people to some degree. It just straight up is an introvert. It is the introverted Pokemon in this case. It does live in skulks, though. If you don't know what a skulk is, it is described as the collection of Vulpix in this case. The reason for this is likely because of its original fire typing. There are cases where there are fire type Pokemon that can make their way through the mountains, but living in them for long periods of time will cause an adaptation, but that can only happen if they survive. So by staying in skulks of Pokemon that they are used to or understand, they feel safe and they will slowly adapt. The better ones at adapting are usually the ones that will continue through generations. Eventually it loses its fire typing and becomes an ice type. Think of it like when you have a wild animal that, again, moves to the mountains and it gets a thicker set of fur. Those with thinner sets of fur are not attractive to the species and as such will die out. Meanwhile, the ones with thicker fur will continue to grow thicker and thicker fur until it is the appropriate thickness in order to survive in the environment. Vulpix doesn't get thicker fur, it just becomes an ice type. The fire organ isn't useful. Ninetales is a really weird one because it gets the fairy typing added to it. But follow me on this one. Very similar to regular Ninetales, but it's considered a deity rather than a cruel Pokemon that curses others. It lives on what is considered holy grounds in this series, which is Mount Lanakila, and it is the parallel to the real tallest mountain in Hawaii, Mauna Kea. which is also a sacred slash holy ground. Now, theoretically, living on holy ground actually made it a fairy type. The main reason for this is that fairy types in Pokemon are considered supernatural creatures that we can't explain. You are getting into, like, angels, deities, cryptids, leprechauns, and God knows what else. Unicorns. We'll cover leprechauns and the unicorns later. So basically, you have this Pokemon that not only adapted to a colder environment, became an ice type when it was a fire type, but because it lived on holy ground, not necessarily because it was praised as a deity, but because it lived on a holy ground, that it actually evolved to withhold that holy energy as it is now a fairy type. The energy of life, to some degree, I suppose. Diglett's a fun one, I think. Originally, Diglett are just regular old moles, right? They dig through the ground, they live their life, so on and so forth. Literally a regular mole. Meanwhile, in a lowland Diglett, the high rich iron in the environment actually caused Diglett to change. It now has these whiskers, quote-unquote whiskers. They call it whiskers, but meh, on the top of its head, which monitor or help it monitor surroundings and helps it relay emotion. As it digs through, it continues to gather all of these strands of iron as it digs through volcanic rock. This makes Diglett not just a ground type, but into a ground steel type, which this does make sense as well. It's affected by its environment directly. It is building it up. We'll come back to iron a lot. Iron in the environment gets transferred into Pokemon a lot in this series for some reason, whether it's through soil or water, and the body has to process it somehow, either process it and release it, or absorb it and have it be a part of it, is what we're really going to be learning here. In the case of Dugtrio, which is still a ground steel type, you now have the fanciful L'Oreal hair, and its whiskers have expanded into a full head of hair that continues to grow. The center one, its hair grows the most, and it continues back. Very, almost mullet-like, I want to say, but not really. All of these strands are actually made of steel. So it went from iron strands that was building up on it to full-on steel. The idea for this is because, remember, it is digging through volcanic rock. So, in order to get steel, you're going to combine different metals together. Appropriately, you actually combine iron and carbon, which it is a volcanic area. You're going to get steel. Amongst a couple other things, I'm not going to overcomplicate it. But by combining all of this together, that is how you're actually ending up with this steel, proper steel type, and having steel hair for a Dugtrio. Now, I will cover Wiglet, which is not a regional form. They do explicitly state that it is actually just a case of evolution of another creature that turned similar to Diglett. This is very similar to animals in real life, such as a few doves, which are actually just pigeons. You have a lot of animals in our world that look very similar, but they are of different species, and you can't really mate them. So, they're separate species, no matter how close they look to each other. That's why misinformation happens, it's why misunderstandings happen, and misidentification. Meowth is going to be a really good example of your environment changing who you are, and how an environment changes a Pokemon. Getting into the idea of nurture. How does that affect personality, and how does that personality affect needs in order to survive? In Alola, Meowth was gifted to the royalty. Its personality changed, and so it also physically changed. Remember, Meowth can be a very greedy creature. It likes money, so on and so forth. And so when you just give it what it wants, and you give it in large abundance, you get this prideful effect. Meanwhile, in Galar, it lived with seafarers. It battled often and became more adapted to battle. Again, these are examples of nurturing changing the nature of a creature, which in other terms can actually be domestication. Going back to the idea of the 10 dogs that we talked about. Think about the dogs that are meant for hunting versus the dogs that are meant for being carried in a purse. I mean, let's be real. That's kind of how it is. Teacup poodles. Now, when it evolves into Persian, or at least Alolan Meowth evolves into Persian, the rich and royalty wanted to keep it proper. They wanted to keep their pets, and this very much relates to real life and inbreeding of animals in order to keep the bloodline a perfect way within a species for bigger eyes or for anything else that you're really looking for with no real proper variability. This ends up causing inbreeding. You can see Persian's face is kind of way more rounded and ovular, which you will get those kinds of deformities, unfortunately, with real-life animals. Just like regular Persian, the coin turned into a jewel, but it's the same material as normal. It is highly intelligent, thinks highly of itself, and will use underhanded tactics, which explains its dark typing. It sees itself as very prim, proper, and higher than thou, but then will sweep you under the rug in order to get everything that it wants. Kind of goes into the idea of corrupt leaders, corrupt royalty. Alternatively, we have another one that's not a regional form, but instead has traveled down a separate path for so long that it is now separated. And that is where you get Berserker, a full-on steel-type Pokemon. It is, again, not a regional form, and it has changed so much that it can't be considered a Persian. It has gotten so used to combat and the idea of it and being ready for it that it's basically considered a savage by the other Meowths, and it doesn't get along with normal Meowth. It doesn't say anything about Alolan Meowth, but I'm pretty sure they wouldn't get along either. So now we're going to take a step back in time for a little bit as we look at Growlithe and, more importantly, Hisuan Growlithe. The Growlithe in Hisui, which, to give you context, is based in the, I believe, the Edo period, 1800s. I will double check that. It is the Edo period! Let's go! Oh my gosh! The Edo period was between 1603 and 1868. That's awesome. Okay, I feel really good about that. Sorry. Anywho. So looking at the 1800s, this is quite a bit in the past, and typically it would take longer for creatures to adapt, but when you have Pokemon that can evolve like this, you can just imagine they evolve in the sense that we understand faster. Bear with me. Hisuan Growlithe has fur that is made of igneous rock. Now, volcanoes have a lot of igneous rock around them, and that's where you'll find them frequently. In addition, this fur that they have is well insulated to protect it from colder Hisui weather. This also makes sense, as if you have a strong outer layer to protect you from the harsher environment, it keeps all the heat trapped inside. Think of it like a thick jacket. Now, another thing it does is that it lives in pairs and bonds with humans. This is, again, going back to the domestication practice of dogs, almost directly this time. It is a social creature. It tries to stay warm, and it is finding companionship in humans to meet its needs. When it evolves into Arcanine, volcanic activity actually changed its body. This, I will say, is likely because it absorbed clastic material. If you know what clastic material is, it is when a volcano erupts. You get clastic material, which is, some of it goes down the volcano, some of it blasts into the sky, and it is a mixture of your carbons, igneous rock, and a bunch of other stuff in between. As such, it just gets absorbed, it becomes bigger, it gets stronger. There's no real other differentiating factors. The primary reason why it changed from rock fire to just fire is due to domestication. It didn't have a need for the thicker fur anymore, which goes back to our talks of the mountain with Sandshrew and Vulpix, or the aforementioned furry creature that gets thicker fur. In this case, it no longer had a need and was able to streamline itself so that it no longer was a rock fire, but just a fire type. Geodude is the easiest and most straightforward, I think, as it is made of a different rock. Literally, that is it. The rock itself has magnetic iron sand in it. It itself is magnetic and releases shocks of electricity, and its fingers no longer have all the different digits and instead are now fused together, When it evolves into Graveler, though, it now has a silvery sheen. It has less digits on its hands and feet, has yellow crystals and iron sand due to magnetism. It is very quick-tempered. I haven't mentioned this, I realize, but this is Alolan Geodude line. It feeds on Dravite, which creates the yellow crystals that you can see throughout its body, and Dravite is diamagnetic, which means that it has a magnetic permeability less than that of a vacuum. It is slightly repelled by a magnet. So it's kind of made up of it, but it's not incredibly magnetic if you're looking at the real life example of it. This is more of the fact that this Pokemon is a conglomerate of all these materials now living, is what this is. Speaking of being a conglomerate of these materials, they are considered the fireworks of the earth due to the booms and flashes that they emit when they fight other Graveler. In addition, they often send enemies flying when rolling at them due to the electricity or the magnetic field in/around their body, unlike their Cantonian Graveler cousins, which will just crush you. As it evolves into Golem, it has shorter forearms than its Cantonian version. It has only 2 claws on its hands and 2 claws on its feet. The face itself actually attracts iron sand, which makes sense with the whole magnetism idea. It can't easily roll into a ball anymore, and that's partially because it has this giant freaking railgun on the back of its head. And that's not even a relative exaggeration. It is quite literally a railgun. It will pick up rocks, shove it in there, and going back to what is now relevant of the Dravite that is now within its body, it can now put these rocks in here and will use its magnetism to just shoot out these rocks. Or if it can't find rocks, it'll use Geodude of its species. So now that you know that it has that repelling magnetism, it now uses that to its benefit and launches stuff. It is very grumpy and stubborn. It roars like thunder as it discharges electricity. And honestly, it's pretty cool. I'm not even gonna remotely lie. It's pretty freaking cool. But you get this idea of, because it is made of a different material, because it has a different natural biology, because Alolan rocks have a different makeup, you now have a different Geodude. By this theory, you should have Geodudes of plenty different species and subspecies that are magnetic, non-magnetic, and so on and so forth. Really, you should theoretically have maybe even an ice Geodude due to compaction of ice. You could probably have a fire rock or fire ground-esque Geodude less. Well, you'd probably still keep it rock. But either way, you can have a fire Geodude if it was closer to volcanic activity and the actual clasts that come out, so on and so forth. I'm not gonna, I need to stop myself. Ignore the fact that I've done a costume change and the fact that the lighting is a little different. I totally didn't have to go and deal with something before not being able to come back until the next day. But since we're here, as a quick side note, thank you for making it this far. If you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe. It takes a lot of effort to not only compile this information, but to be able to explain it with real life terms. In ways that make sense to, hopefully, you. In addition to that, please go check out my other content. I do a lot of supercuts, Pokemon Violet Nuzlocke. I've done a randomizer Nuzlocke that I'm actually doing the edit for right now. I release stuff weekly. I react to the Pokemon series, and I live stream here on YouTube. So, come say hi. Say hi in the comments. Also, why not? Give your favorite regional form. And if you don't know all the regional forms, you're going to learn, and then give your favorite. So, Ponyta. Ponyta has gone from a fire type to a fairy type. This is because of the life energy in Galar's forests that just continually give off this energy and is exposing Ponyta to a different world or environment, really. Its fur is now chalk white. It no longer has fire, and it's covered in a colorful fur pigmented by life energy absorption. The horn has healing energy. It can read the contents of a person's heart by looking into their eyes, can send visions across regions, and it goes into hiding from evil individuals if it notices them. The magical forest stuff is really weird, and I wanted to loosely tie it in with photosynthesis or stuff like that, but really it's just its environment forcing a change onto a creature. Think of it like the iron-rich areas or soils that we've gotten that have changed Diglett and Dugtrio.
in Alola. Now, when Ponyta evolves into Rapidash, it becomes more obvious, if it wasn't already, that it is based off of the unicorn, which also helps explain the fairy typing in terms of categorizing things. Now, it has a longer horn due to it being used more, it is brave and prideful, the horn pierces through sheet metal, and the horn can cure disease and neutralize poisons. Again, very reminiscent of unicorn stories, lore. That one's fairly obvious. You can kind of relate that to mechanical use in species causing evolution. If you look at birds with a longer beak versus a short, stubbier, blunter beak eat different seeds because their beaks are more useful for those types of seeds, and it's because in the environments that they lived in, those seeds are what was available or what were available to it based on the environment or other creatures in the area that reduced food sources. Moving on to Slowpoke, this one is, ironically, speaking about seeds, all because of its diet of Galarica seeds that had changed its appearance and behavior. It now has a different coloration. Its tail, instead of it being sweet, is now spicy, which causes difficulty when fishing for food, so it has moved away from water sources as much. There's no real need for that, and so it's eating more and more of these Galarica seeds, which in turn has removed it from being a psychic water type to now just a pure psychic type. And every once in a while, it just has an occasional deeper thought, and you can see it as they furrow their brow, and then they forget and go back to normal. When it evolves, Slowbro evolves by a Shelder biting its tail. But in the Galarian region, you have the Shelder no longer liking the taste of the tail, and instead decides to bite the arm. Now, the Shelder's poison and the Galarica spices causes a chemical reaction inside of Slowbro's body that creates a poison. The Shelder that is biting it potentially feels bliss when biting hard enough to absorb the poison, and if it ever stops absorbing the poison, even for a short amount of time, the Slowbro lashes out due to the pain and itching that the poison causes and will indiscriminately attack its surroundings. Slowbro also in this form actually becomes more competitive when facing stronger opponents. It will fire poisonous liquids from its arm, and it moves incredibly quick. There's something very not slow about this Slowbro, and it is clearly more intelligent. Something different is happening here. It is now also a psychic poison type. Galarian Slowking now has the bite of the Shelder on its head, just as regular Slowking does, but now this causes a different outcome due to the chemical reaction that we talked about previously. The Shelder actually becomes more dominant in this situation as the poison excretes from the Shelder. The Shelder gets sharper teeth and changes color with the Slowking itself. The Shelder becomes more intelligent, actually, and controls the Slowking now. Whereas Johtonian Slowking gets the bite on its head, and it activates neurons, I guess. It does something to its brain that now allows it to think. It connects the wires, and is now able to think better. While Galarian Slowking is that, but for the Shelder, for that parasite that's on its head. Galarian Slowking now chants spells and incantations to battle, create toxins, or when communicating. These chants are in an unknown language, and while they also create potions by mixing toxins with the food it consumes, the effect of the potions are unknown even to Slowking, as it then tests them on weaker Pokemon to figure out what those potions can do. I'm not gonna lie to you, this is probably one of the most evil regional forms that exists out there, and it is terrifying. I never want to be anywhere near a Galarian Slowking, and I'm scared over the fact that they exist. Please keep them far away from me. And this all started with the fact that Slowpoke's diet changed, allowing these chemical reactions to occur and changing the overall physiology of the creature. Which, diet does change the creature overall, who would have guessed. Now we move on to Farfetch'd and Galarian Farfetch'd. Galarian Farfetch'd now has a darker color, it has larger eyebrows, which makes it less friendly looking, a larger leek, stronger body, difficulty flying, is courageous and uses its leek as a sword or javelin, and it evolves after surviving many battles. So you've gone from this Pokemon that relies on its ability to fly and get away, while also using its leek as a form of defense or as its prized possession, as a last-second defense maybe. It now uses the leek as its primary weapon, and its wings are no longer carrying it because of its stronger body its larger size overall. So it's starting to rely less and less on its wings. Again, you're getting into this concept of preferred evolution, where you are using something more and more and using other things less and less. So you are now changing your physical body over time, as we've talked about a number of times before. Because of this, and this constant use, we now get Surfetched. Now, technically, this is not a variant at this point, because it goes beyond what a regular Farfetch'd can do. It is now calm and collected, it fights fairly, it is very noble, and its leak is a lot larger. It's still its prized possession, its weapon, and its food. When that leak withers, it retires, which I think is a really cool idea. That's really fun. I love Surfetch'd, and I think a lot of people do too. If I'm wrong, I'll be kind of shocked. I mean, it's goofy and I love it. Moving on to Alolan Grimer. The Cantonian Grimer was brought to Alola to deal with excess waste. It eats solid garbage here instead of the sludge that it would normally eat, which caused its body composition to change. Its teeth are actually crystallized toxins. Lethal poisons leak from the body when these crystals fall out, and it's unknown how to break down these crystals. Alolan Grimer is perpetually hungry, constantly eating trash, and if it can't do that, it'll try to eat manufactured products. And it preys on Trubbish and Garbodor. It has this oil slick appearance, which is a major threat in Hawaii. You look at water sources, you look at oil spills and all these things, and that's where it has its relation too. Now, I'm not gonna keep hammering this, this nail into the coffin here and talking about how your diet changes what you are. But again, this is actually very similar to Alolan Raichu, where you have different environment, different diets, different everything, and you are now adapting to it. You have to become a creature that is going to be able to process these quote-unquote foods that you now eat better and better and better, more and more efficiently, because they are constantly hungry. Their purpose is just to do that, and they don't think anything else of it, because that's how they grow. That's how they evolve. So when we get into Alolan Muck, the oil spill appearance is much greater and more apparent. The crystallized poison shards are now throughout the body, and the body contains hundreds of different types of poison. There are now chemical reactions constantly happening within its body, and Alolan Muck is quiet and friendly, but it will eat furnishings for food if it's not fed properly. And it's really weird to say that, though, because regular Muck isn't said to be aggressive. It's just that regular or Cantonian Muck just destroys everything it comes across. And that's not because it does it on purpose, that's just what it does. It just has that much poison in its body. Meanwhile, we're seeing that in Alolan Muck, the crystals throughout its body actually contain the toxins. We don't know how to break them down, but they are properly contained, which means they could be stored away somewhere and not cause immense damage. Now, another thing that it does is that it does not produce a foul stench because these toxins are well contained. So basically, they took a very dangerous creature, Cantonian Muck, and found a way to use its hunger and want for eating sludge and garbage and turn that into a tool for it. They domesticated Muck. And so now Muck adapted to the domestication and was able to contain these toxins because it needs to. Because it needs to. If it wants to get what it wants, it needs to comply to the domestication practice. We go back to dogs. We go back to horses, not zebras. Not zebras. Zebras, a small fun fact, the state of Wisconsin tried to domesticate zebras. Actually, I believe a number of different, the colonies tried to do that. And zebras would not have it. Meanwhile, other horses could be domesticated and their forms changed. Dogs obviously changed. We know that. I've talked about that so many times already, amongst other creatures, that their domestication changes what they are. Cows, for example. Regular cows do not exist. Not like the way that we see them. Voltorb and Hisuian Voltorb. So we're going back to the 1800s, going back to the Edo period, as the Hisuian form resembles an apricorn-made Pokeball, but we already know for fact that the Hisuian Voltorb existed before the creation of the Pokeball. The reason for this is that the legendary hero had a Hisuan Voltorb on their team. When looking inside of Hisuan Voltorb, it can be seen that there are numerous seeds inside of it, as it is a grass electric type. But trying to study these seeds any further has resulted in nothing, because you can't really see it is pitch black inside of this creature. It stores electric currents in its belly. It is friendly and excitable in comparison to its Cantonian counterpart, which is very angry and excitable in the very destructive way. It does tend to cluster around people because it's very friendly, which is a very big problem if it decides to discharge, because and whenever it does discharge, it sounds like a laugh of sorts. So a very jolly creature. The hole on the top of its body is where the electricity comes out of. So when people want to move it in Hisui, they would actually plug the hole and then move it, just to prevent the discharge. Now, this is a strange case considering modern Voltorb does not occur naturally. So what I'm going to compare this to is that, or the potential of this, is that Hisuan Voltorb potentially went extinct and was reborn, quote-unquote reborn, by pure chance, which is something we have seen in modern day. There have been birds or fish that we can track a very, very similar looking creature in the ancient times too, but they are not genetically related at all. This also goes back to the dove versus pigeon argument, where you have a lot of creatures that look similar but are not actually the same, albeit in this case, we just have a very special situation where they actually are related, and that the environments, the nature, the nurture, and everything else has replicated this creature in the modern day, which, amazing. When Hisuan Voltorb evolves into Electrode, it is still wooden just as Hisuan Voltorb is, but now it looks angry. It lets out electricity and can now store chlorophyll energy. Again, going back to the grass typing or the fact that it has seeds in it and so on and so forth. It can also apparently climb trees, which is scary, and I don't want to be walking through the woods and not only have to worry about cougars in the trees, but also giant freaking Electrode that can drop on me and go boom. I think this one's really fun, and I like the history of this one as we move on to Executor versus Alolan Executor as we are back in the modern day. Alolan Executor grows like tropical palm trees or coconut trees rather than the desert palm that a Cantonian Executor grows like. As such, it has grown much taller and has an extra head that defends the rear. Again, if you're gonna have this massive neck that you are, 100 feet up in the air, you need some way to defend your lower body. So now it has this head on the tail that can be a lookout and help defend. Its neck, very much like a giraffe, is used as a whip against enemies. Its increased height reduced the need for psychic powers and instead awakened draconic powers. I have no idea how that one works out. I'm not even gonna try and pretend I do. I don't know how you turn psychic energy into dragon energy. I get the idea that, okay, if your psychic power is based on your brain, and if your brain is farther from other brain no brain hurt other brain to brain. This is nonsense at this point, please, for the love of God, just ignore this part. Alolan Executor is considered the pride of Alola, and is proud of its own appearance as well. And it even lives on its own island called Executor Island, where there are a bunch of them. Like regular coconut trees, and due to the pride in their height, they compete for height because of sunlight, but also because they just want to be taller than each other. And that's just why they're so tall. The combination of their needs and what they want has created this creature. Alolan Marowak is another really cool one. I know I keep saying they're cool, but I'm a little bit biased. I think regional forms are honestly one of the best things that Pokemon has created, and we'll get back to that later. I'm not going to go off on my rant now. What's fun about Alolan Marowak is that any Cubone, regardless of where they come from, when introduced to Alola, will evolve into Alolan Marowak. This is caused due to the abundance of natural enemies, i.e. grass types. When you combine the fact that you have a very lonely creature that is in a very harsh environment, it either falters and will get wiped out, or will become stronger due to the pressure. So, What it does is that it tries to adapt to the environment while also forming close bonds with allies to increase its survival rate, which opens up its sixth sense apparently. Because now, this Marowak is a fire ghost type, which honestly is sick. It is considered one of the favorites regional forms because it finally fulfills the wants that people just desired for years and years when it came to a Marowak evolution. Now it is more combat adept. Its bone is larger. It uses it as a weapon. It can control fire, wisps, will-o-wisps, so on and so forth. And it will mourn its companions as it has a stronger bond with them, often dancing as it mourns for them. It can create a flame that can't be put out by water that also causes physical and mental pain, which is honestly terrifying because it is adapted so well to the harsh environment that it looks at its predators and goes, you can't hurt me anymore, and you can't stop me from hurting you. And that's scary. That's really scary. We're very lucky that Alolan Marowak is not aggressive and is actually fairly friendly, because Alola is surrounded by water. So how do you make sure your predators cannot come back after you, or your competition can't come back after you? You make sure the #1 resource is not usable. Alolan Marowak is one of the perfect forms of a regional form that has adapted to its environment and how it is treated and the pressure in order to come out on top. In other words, this is just another example of nurturing, same as what happened with Meowth, that creates a new evolution. Okay, we're going to talk about Weezing, which is, it has its Galarian Weezing counterpart. I love it. I think the design is great. I think it's fun. It's fantastic. We're going to talk about it. It is a poison fairy type, okay? Galarian form is the way that it is because it absorbed polluted air from factories. I'd like to think of it like osmosis, where coughing is a very poisonous little ball of destruction, right? It releases toxins and gas into the air. Well, if you think about it as osmosis, there's clean air, toxic creature, it releases it to purify itself. Well, now you have the opposite. Galar is known to be very polluted. So you can't really let that out, and it's so polluted that it is now letting it in and trying to find a way to change it internally, since it doesn't want the poison that's in its body. So now it has evolved into this Galarian Weezing that it purifies the air that goes into its body. It actually goes out the hat that's on its head, which is reminiscent of a smokestack, which really cool considering, you know, scrubbers instead of smokestacks and everything like that. The gas clouds surrounding Galarian Weezing are still poisonous, which makes sense. It's kind of gathering it around it for use and then absorbing it in. It is still a poison fairy type, and it preys on Trubbish. Now, here's the part where I get a little upset, because people suspect that it's related or possibly based on a leprechaun because of the green and the facial hair it has. That's a stretch. That's a stretch. Like, I've done some stretches here, and I've backed it up as best as I can, but that is a stretch. I'm just gonna say that the idea of perfect purification is a magical thing, in addition to the idea that we are dealing with the idea of life essence and the creation of it, or something that is pure, similar to how we have seen with the Vulpix line or the Ponyta line. And now we have Galarian Weezing, which is creating good and purity. So maybe that's another part of what fairy typings can be. Goodness, purity, not just mystical creatures. I don't know. We're moving on. Galarian Mr. Mime was made because Mime Jr. liked the tap dancing of Mr. Rhyme, most likely. Which, Mr. Rhyme is an evolution of Galarian Mr. Mime. So which came first? The chicken or the egg kind of situation here. I'm just gonna chalk this up as tap dancing in general is what inspired Mime Jr., created Galarian Mr. Mime. It loved it so much, it became so adapted in it that it became Mr. Rhyme, which I'm not even gonna cover, because it's so far off at that point. And that started to create this cycle of Mr. Rhymes and so on and so forth. A great talent in tap dancing, and it controls temperatures and creates floors of ice, which it will then kick up and send flying at its foes. Fairly simple. Another creature that nurturing has changed, and it actually did it of its own volition out of preference. I think that's called preferable selection. Moving on to Tauros, we are now in the Paldean region, as Tauros in general all have their natures dependent on their environment. Now, Tauros is typically aggressive in its, Cantonian, in Johto, so on and so forth. But it is calmer in Alola, and the Alolan form doesn't have a different form. It's just regular Tauros. But it is even more aggressive in Paldea, which has turned it into a fighting-type Pokemon. Now, somehow it gets its fire and water forms. That's not really evolution. That's just kind of strange dependencies. Now, their inspiration is where we can derive some of this from, and it could explain how it gets those forms to some degree, but it also paints a kind of dark history of Paldea. Because if we look at the real-life examples and look at the fire and water forms, those are references to real-life controversial bullfights where, in one case, bull horns are set on fire, or the other one where the bulls will chase the people in the bullfight through the city all the way out, and then they will dip as these bulls now go into the Mediterranean Sea, where you can kind of guess what happens next. And if Tauros was subjected to this, then you can imagine that it would eventually adapt in order to overcome this contested environment that it's constantly being put in. Now, as a personal thing, it's not really controversial. I know I used the word controversial. I just dislike this idea, and it's kind of sad to find out. I don't like these things happening to animals. The legendary birds are strange examples that have only really developed their different forms because they all constantly migrate around the world. I can't find additional information on this outside of that based on the Pokédex or other inquiries that I'm able to look into. So all three of them have the same idea of they constantly go around the world. Now, if we look at the three of them and how they differ outside of their typings of Psychic, Dark, and Fighting, you're also getting three creatures that seem to stay relatively near each other and band together to some degree. And how are they going to stay together while also meeting and aiding in each other's weaknesses so that way they may survive as they constantly migrate? Outside of the typing, you now have Articuno, which gets the goggles to protect its eyes as it flies incredibly fast. The Zapdos now gets to run faster, basically being your ground patrol, and because of that, it no longer has these strong wings, and instead has stronger legs, as it is now a fighting type. And then finally, Moltres, which is a dark type, just repels other Pokemon with oppressive energy. The rest of the details that I could find don't seem to really relate or explain their evolutionary differences compared to their Cantonian counterparts. So that one's a little drier. Maybe we'll find out more stuff in the future. I love Woopers. It is by far one of the best and most direct entries to this point because it flat out says that it lived in water in Paldean ancient times. It was eventually forced out. It adapted to the land via two methods, slowly over time, which was by hardening its gills and then developing a poisonous film that it coats its body in to keep it from drying, as it is now a poison ground type. It now lives in marshes, and it can swim through water by all means. It just doesn't really prefer it, and it is slower overall, so it can't run away, and instead uses the poison as a defense mechanism, shooting it at other Pokemon in order to defend itself. They also live in groups and take rides on Clodsire, so that way they don't have to swim. Probably because if they go swimming, it likely washes off what film they have. When we look at Clodsire, again, this is another situation where the evolution is so far removed from the original that it is no longer considered a variant, and instead it's its own species. As such, there's not really much that I'm really going to cover with Clodsire, and I'm not really going to cover them I just like the way they look. They're adorable, and I would love a giant plush of them one day. Qwilfish took some freaking work to get through, as this whole explanation of why Hisuan Qwilfish in the 1800s was a dark poison type, but modern Qwilfish are water poison. And it all relates to the idea of fugu, which is the eating of pufferfish. If you don't know, pufferfish are poisonous. You cannot just flat out eat pufferfish. The only way you can eat pufferfish is if a properly licensed, professional, incredibly tested chef then takes the pufferfish, cuts out the poisonous areas, and then allows you to have it. That is a delicacy that is incredibly dangerous if done ever so slightly wrong. So, back to Qwilfish with this idea, as fugu was illegal in the 1800s, which again is the Edo period, which is around the time when Legends Arceus takes place in Hisui. Modern Qwilfish, again, is not a dark type, it's not as deadly, but it's still poisonous. Now, over time, we eventually would have gotten these chefs that would have been able to properly dissect Qwilfish for eating. There were fishermen in the Hisuian times that were eating fish Pokemon. Now, by removing this restriction over time, you are now able to hunt this creature. So, the poison of the Qwilfish wasn't working to deter its enemies, which are also the fishermen, anymore. It now had to develop a new skill. As such, it develops the ability to hold water and puff up itself to defend itself while shooting its spikes, which are still poisonous, but it's a different method. These spikes are different, they are not as poisonous. Now, when Hisuan Qwilfish evolves into Overqwil, fun, stupid name, I just smile thinking about it, it's still dependent on those spikes, which is what helped me determine this divergence. As the poison spikes have worked to defend itself, they are much larger now, they are sharper, they can't be removed as easily, and of course they cause plenty of poison. But again, this is a bit of a divergence. You now have a Pokemon that is not properly related and is not a variant. Jotonian Sneasel versus Hisuan Sneasel. We're actually staying in the 1800s for this one, because if we look at the ancient Sneasel, its environment itself changed this one as well. It is not as spiteful as its Jotonian counterpart. It lives on rocky mountains in the Coronet Highlands and has sharper claws for climbing and piercing foes. It can also poison its foes. Not really sure why it can do that. Probably because of the plant life that is there. It's very possible. I'm not gonna... that one's kind of weird all in all. But because it's not as spiteful and because of the methods that it goes about things and its environment, it is a fighting poison type rather than being a dark ice type. Yes, Hisuan Sneasel can live in the colder areas, but it does kind of just live in rocky, mountainous areas. When it evolves into Sneasler, it is not considered a variant of Weavile, but it is still worth comparing, I believe, as it lives alone rather in packs. Remember that Weavile is a dark ice type. It will not fight fair, it will live in packs, and it will gang up on people. It is very strong despite its physical physique. Again, you can say that because of all the mountain climbing that it does, and its claws are still sharp and distribute plenty of poison. Corsola is a sad one as we look at its Alolan counterpart, as it's one of my favorites, to be honest. Corsola was wiped out in Galar, that be by predators, or more primarily by the warming of the waters. Thank you, global warming, for killing my Pokemon. I wanted to escape reality, and now it's here in my video games. Anywho, basically this is supposed to represent coral bleaching in real life, which is the warming of the waters, which will kill coral, as they can't adapt fast enough to these warming waters as well. Now Corsola, having come back from the dead as a pure ghost type, consumes spirit energy in order to continue living, and it kind of lets off shells of ectoplasm as it continues to grow. Now you have Cursola, which is still a pure ghost type. Now we're branching off again from what regular Corsola can be and into a different species, as it doesn't do a lot of other different things other than turns others to stone if they are touched. Back to modern times, we have Zigzagoon and Galarian Zigzagoon, which is very interesting to me because this is the first instance where it is directly stated that a different region's version of a Pokemon came first before the one that we were aware of, as Galarian Zigzagoon came first. It is far more restless and aggressive. They're found everywhere in Galar, and it challenges everyone it comes across. But because it's so happy looking and its tongue is out and it's just constantly going after you, humans mistook this as it wanting affection, not as it being aggressive. So, despite its frustrations, we literally sat here and said, "You're such a cute puppy, I love you so much," and domesticated this thing. And as such, when it got domesticated and brought over to Kanto, it ended up just being calmer, but still has that fervent energy within it. Galarian Lanoon recklessly challenges Stronger's opponents and will taunt and enrage them before tackling. It is a dark normal type, and again, the whole idea of a dark type are underhanded tactics, so it's going to get you as angry as you can so that way you can't think, and then it's going to strike at you in ways that you're not ready for. Now, it does have great strength in these attacks that it does, as it will then tackle you at 60 miles per hour. It is highly competitive in the harsh Galar environment, as it is adapted to this harsh environment and is trying to come out on top at all times. And when we look at the Cantonian version, the Cantonian version still only runs in straight lines at 60 miles per hour, but it's nowhere near as aggressive. Instead, the Cantonian version just keeps a stash of secret items, likely because it is still holding on to that idea of, hey, I don't know why I have to do this, but I have to store as much food as I can, because its genetics still thinks it's living in a harsh environment. It's very reminiscent of humans and society, where we have very quickly developed ways to mass produce food, so that way first world countries don't starve. And despite that, our human psyche, when we see food in front of us, a lot of people will still just eat, because it makes you think, I don't know when I'm going to be able to eat again, and this is a feast to help me survive long term. Now, AbsolGoon is the next stage evolution of the Galarian form, which does not exist in Kanto, and it simply exists, again, because of the harsh and competitive Galar environment, as it has now not only relished in it, but has come out on top and continues to relish in this environment. Taking another step back into Hisui, we have Samurott. When we compare it to its Unovian form, I'm going to say Unovian. Unovan? Oh, it's Unovan. I'm keeping that in. When we compare it to its Unovan form, which is its modern day form, this one takes a little bit of history in order to understand. The Hisuan form is underhanded, ruthless, and aggressive. Meanwhile, the Unovan one is a leader of groups, is strict, fights fair, and is a military commander. The Hisuan one is based on an extinct otter, and it might actually represent Ronin, samurai without a lord or master to serve, considering that Samurott is a samurai, and now we're looking at these Edo period times where Ronin were way more prevalent, or samurai in general were way more prevalent. As such, Ronin basically become dishonored mercenaries, which explains why this Hisuan Samurott is underhanded, will do anything to win, has serrated blades, and will not stop until its foe is defeated. Now, some of that does carry into modern day Samurott in behavior, as when it does fight without mercy, but is not underhanded and is very fair, which would separate why you have modern Samurott being a water fighting type and Hisuan one being a dart water type. Staying in Hisui, we have Hisuan Lilligant, which was a fighting grass type in Hisui. It traversed mountains, which can explain why it had the legs that it does, but the flower on its head still emitted an attractive scent. Now, over time, what it likely did is that it adapted to attracting mates using this scent more and more, rather than searching for them itself. As such, it lost its need to move as much and became a pure grass type and got a larger flower on its head. Now, this is all supported by the fact that once a Lilligant finds a male or a mate, the flower then wilts. The only other exception to this is when it's kind of forced by people to open up its flower, and then the flower wilts. This sounds really dirty. I can feel my face getting warm. I'm gonna move on from this because that just sounded really weird. I'm sorry. Darumaka is fairly simple as we're moving back into the modern age. Sorry that we're doing so much time traveling, but again, I wanted to do this in Pokédex order. But Darumaka versus Galarian Darumaka is only changed because of the seismic shift that happened in Galar, which caused the warm climate to cool. As such, Darumaka adapted, and the fire organ within its body became a cold organ. When it evolves into Darmanitan, because of the cold organ, it is no longer so aggressive and belligerent. Now it is gentle and actually rather timid. It uses the snowball in its head to store food, and if it ever feels like it's threatened, it will turn into a snowman to hide. Although, here's where those past behaviors dig into its modern self, especially since it seems like this was a much faster shift than a lot of other Pokemon, meaning that it hasn't fully adapted or changed as it needed to. Or, in this case, it has the second adaptation, or kept this adaptation, in order to make sure it protected itself. Because when it goes into its Zen mode, it reawakens to its maddened and rampaging form that its original Fire Darmanitan would do in Unova, and now rages and destroys things with fire indiscriminately as a Fire Ice type. Yamask is weird because we're looking at Galarian versus Unovan Yamask, and Galarian Yamask was born from a cursed clay tablet that attached itself to a vengeful spirit, whereas Unovan Yamask is just a human spirit that came back as a Pokemon. The tablet here absorbs the energy that the vengeful spirit gives off, and the ancient curse that is here within this tablet actually evolves Yamask, which there is a very loose connection potentially because of the fact that it has the clay tablet, because it has the markings on it, and because of the significance of where you evolve it, i.e. the stone arch in the dusty bowl, which resembles a dolmen or a tomb, the fact that the monoliths in the dusty bowl resemble a stone ship, which we'll talk about a little bit more, and the rune drawing, once it does evolve, looks like the world serpent, which represents life, death, and rebirth. When you add in the 49 points of health that it has to have damaged to it in order for it to evolve in or around this area, it could actually be potentially based on the Daldagast and the 49 days of purgatory before reincarnation in Buddhism. Very freaking complicated way to make a Pokemon evolve, but honestly pretty freaking sick, I have to admit. Because once it evolves into Runerigous, it's evolved because it is formed from the painting imbued with the ancient curse. If it is touched, the memories behind the painting's creation are forced onto the person that touched it. The runestones are very reminiscent of Vikings that would paint runes to commemorate the fallen. In addition, that ties into the whole idea of the ship-like monolith assortment, and the fact that when you look at the drawing, it looks very reminiscent, I keep using that word, of the world serpent, which represents life, death, and rebirth. It is such a intricate, hard line to follow, but it's one of my favorites, without a doubt, just because of how intricate it is, no matter how complicated that evolution is. I think Runerigous is also sick looking, not even gonna try and deny it. Zorua is another sad one, as we already know, your Unovan Zorua is not very trusted. It is a trickster fox. It's based on the old foxes of lore, which are very trickster and will become other people and so on and so forth. So when you combine the fact that people have this superstition, and then now you go back into the past where it all derived from and actually make it a real thing, because Hisuan Growlithe was run out of towns, because now you have the origin of where these supernatural foxes came from and the quote-unquote evil that they would cause or were suspected to cause. Because in ancient times of Hisui, Zora were run out of towns often. They were already afraid of Pokemon, and now you have Pokemon that are transforming and trying to mimic children or replace people in order to get food, and also causing tricks on people. So of course they would run them out. Unfortunately, because of this, Zora died in the cold wilds, and now they hold a grudge, allowing them to be reborn with malice, turning them from a dark type, Trickster Fox, to a ghost normal type, and now it draws power from spite and terror. Other than that, it's pretty much the same. As it evolves into Hisuan Zoroark, it is said to resemble the embodiment of death. Its illusions, whereas Unnovan Zoroark do not cause pain or anything like that and are non-tangible illusions, the illusions of Hisuan Zoroark can actually cause physical harm due to the immense power of spite that it holds in its body. It hates everything that is living and will attack recklessly. The only things that it is compassionate towards are Zora and those that it trusts if you can somehow manage to survive and it likes you enough. If you mess that up, good luck. You're not making it into the afterlife. Stunfisk is weird because Stunfisk originally exists as an electric ground type Pokemon that allowed bacteria into its body, and due to the bacteria in its body and all the energy from those, it was actually able to generate electricity. When we look at Galarian Stunfisk, it is now a ground steel type. This is because of the high iron content mud that is in the Galar region, which made it tougher instead of it absorbing the bacteria. Its body is harder, now with stronger fins. Now it is not as elastic or mobile because its Unnovan counterpart, whenever it needed to escape, would actually expand and contract its body, flexing it so that way it could launch itself further and further away as it could make a fast escape. Well, it's not as flexible due to the high iron content, so it had to adapt, and instead adapted to its surroundings, the harsh environment, and camouflaged itself as it became a bear trap and lure, its mouth looking like a Pokeball. I don't know a single Pokemon that would want to actually walk up to a Pokeball, so it's a little scary because it feels like it's hunting people, which it very well could be doing as a countermeasure naturally in order to get rid of pollution, because there are creatures in this world that we can suspect are used as a counter to us. For example, viruses. Viruses exist to cull populations overall. So now we have a Pokemon that does that instead. And what do we do in the games the most, let alone what people might do in the shows or anything else? If you were to see a Pokeball, you're gonna go grab it because, oh no, what if this is a Pokemon inside of it? Not even thinking about the items that could be inside if you were playing the games. And all it takes is that, a single touch, and chomp. Gone. I don't like that. I don't like the fact that I do not like that Stunfisk in Galar has adapted to kill humans. Ugh. We're going to slip into the past for the final portion of this one last time as we're going into Hisui 1800s Edo period. As we look at Braviary. Braviary in the modern times of Unova is a normal flying type. Meanwhile, if we look at the past one, it is a psychic flying type. The Hisuan form lives alone rather than in flocks. Its cries are imbued with psychic power to stun its prey, and it can enter a trance to boost physical power and heighten its sixth sense. The real only difference here is that it's based on the stellar sea eagle rather than the bald eagle. This is just regional difference and overall adaptation. The only way I can really make any sort of assumptions as to why it lost its psychic ability is because as we humans began to populate areas more and more, it created a more suitable and less harsh environment for Braviary, because you'll find Hisuan Braviary in the Alabaster Icelands, where it's really cold and genuinely really difficult to survive. Meanwhile, when you look at Unova and the clustered city, you now have areas where it can survive much easier. It will have to get used to living in larger groups or flocks now, and it no longer needs the enhanced physical ability due to its psychic power. As such, it loses it and becomes a normal type. That's my general speculation. I want to hear what everyone else's speculations for all of these are. If there's anybody that disagrees, I want to hear your educated opinions. Hisuan Sliggoo, we can look at regular Sliggoo and kind of see where the adaptation comes in. It's fairly straightforward, as regular Sliggoo already looks like it should have a small shell on it, but Hisuan Sliggoo actually has a full-on shell, now being a dragon steel type, theorized to form from the iron-rich waters that are in Hisui. Otherwise, it acts the exact same, and it just utilizes its shell as you would expect it to. Looking at Hisuan Gudra, it also acts very similar to the Colossian Gudra. It hates being alone and can control the shell hardness at will. Its eyes are smaller than Colossian version, but its horns are longer. We can kind of relate this to snails and their long stalks, allowing them to see outside of their shell instead of exposing their entire body and risking their life. And it now drips metallic gray slime instead of just the regular slime that a Colossian Gudra may drip. It is also likely based on the Scalyfoot gastropod, which has a iron sulfide based shell. Really freaking cool, and overall a very one-to-one comparison and understanding. Avalugg and Hisuan Avalugg are different in the fact that Avalugg, ice. Hisuan Avalugg, rock ice. Now, the Hisuan version is smaller and weighs half as much. We can look at glaciers and see that their weight and density are much higher than a lot of different rocks. And when we look at Hisuan Avalugg, its head is harder than the rest of its body. The plate on its head are actually harder than steel. Meanwhile, your modern Avalugg actually has its entire body being as hard as steel. It can break through boulders and shovel deep into the snow, which makes sense as in Hisuan times the glaciers, I guess, aren't as developed or something like that. That's a really weird one, honestly. But it is docile and lives in steep mountains, and it doesn't expand or contract due to the heat like your Colossian Avalugg would. Finally, we're on to the last regional form. Thank you for sticking around, as this one is another one I'm sad to see, but is another one that I'm happy that is covered as we look at Decidueye versus Hisuan Decidueye, as it was obvious when we first saw Alolan Decidueye that it was based off of an extinct bird, the stilt bird, the burrowing owl, so on and so forth. Hisuan Decidueye is nomadic, stalwart, fierce, and doesn't tolerate hostile individuals. It fights in close range and has strong legs and hidden arrow quills with shorter wings. It is very Ronin-like. If you remember when we were talking about samurai, there are Ronin out there that are dishonored mercenaries, but there are some that still try to hold on to what they were during their times as a samurai. This all adds to the idea that the Alolan form is based off of an extinct owl, because when you have a animal that is very aggressive and is recklessly aggressive, then odds are it's going to go extinct rather quickly, unless there are tons of it. So, as a measure of sorts, it did its best to actually adapt and change, because otherwise it would get wiped out. And with that, that's all the regional forms. I think regional forms are one of the best things that Pokemon have come up with. They breathe life into old designs and old Pokemon, while also adding to the stories and history that we already have with old or new Pokemon at this point. And whether they're fan favorites or not, these are opportunities to create something better, or just at least different than what we have. I don't know if I've met someone who likes the original versions more than their regional form counterparts. I know I'm someone where I look at all the regional counterparts and I love them to bits. I think every single one is an improvement in comparison to their original, at least by the facts of looking at history and how they adapted at the very least. It also all relates strongly to how real life works, as I've relatively explained as best as I can with each example. And being an environmental nerd and having taken college courses in that, yeah, I'm in love. I'm in love with regional variants, and I hope we get tons and tons more as life goes on, as even if Pokemon doesn't do it themselves, this has opened the door to people within the community to think about variants around the world, which I love seeing every single day. So with that then, as always, thank you so much for watching. Don't do anything I wouldn't do. Don't think I would do. Please be nice to each other. I love you, and I'll see you next time. Bye!